are on hiatus at the Special Report, and we are revisiting some of our favorite shows. This week is Thought Leaders. We hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in. Activist, scholar, culture critic, and New York Times best-selling author Dr. Cornel West made headlines last month after resigning from his position at the Harvard Divinity School. In a scathing resignation letter that went viral, Dr. West blasted the renowned institution for alleged racism and discrimination. Dr. West joins me for an exclusive Special Report interview. Coming up next.
Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Praised by the New York Times for his ferocious moral vision and hailed by Newsweek as an elegant prophet with attitude, Dr. Cornel West has been a leading voice on social justice and race issues for over 4 decades. A multiple New York Times best-selling author of several books, including Race Matters and Democracy Matters, Dr. West has marched in civil rights demonstrations, taught at Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, and is currently a professor at Union Theological Seminary. Good morning and welcome to the show, Dr. West.
Well, thank you, my dear sister. I salute you and the magnificent work that you are doing. You know, my dear brother Mark Ridley Thomas, for whom I would take a bullet, he sings your praises, and I believe every word. I believe every word.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. It's been a real pleasure just watching you and following you and reading your works. I just was reminded that I have this really big, thick book called The Cornel West Reader that's on my shelf. I can't pretend that I've read every page of it, but I definitely have read a lot of your work, and you know what you have done and continue to do is just incredible. I think the recent headlines that you've made with respect to your resignation from Harvard hit me really hard. You know, I'm a Harvard Law School graduate, and I'd like to think that the university that I take a lot of pride in saying that I'm associated with would have known better and would have done better. And I think it's hard for a lot of people like me to understand how can someone like you, given the body of work that you have, given that you had tenure at Harvard at a previous time, how could you be in this position where they weren't offering you tenure this time? Help us understand that, because it's really hard for us to wrap our brains around that.
Yes, we'd have to ask the Harvard administration about that. You know how ridiculous white supremacy can be. You know how ridiculous any set of prejudice. It could be against Palestinians, it could be against Arabs, against Muslims, against women, against Jews, whatever. And when these prejudices begin to operate, then it clouds their judgment in terms of academic standards. And we know all of these universities have good people, and they have people who need much more work to do, spiritually and morally. And it is ridiculous and ludicrous. I've been a university professor. That's 12 professors out of 2,000 at Harvard in 1996. But in 2021, they only want to put me up for a tenure process. I mean, it's sick. It's ridiculous. So that in that sense, it's beyond hypocrisy. I'm much more concerned about the young brothers and sisters of all colors, but especially the chocolate ones who are locked in the situations of being disrespected and devalued and dismissed, that don't have a landing ground. See, I can go back to Union. I had a number of universities to offer me positions right after the word got out. But for the other folk, they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have a spotlight in that way. And that's why it's so very important to cast a spotlight on these universities as a whole, the tie to their donors, the tie to their big money, the prejudices that are operating, the difficulty of treating people fair, and most importantly, to get them to respect Black people.
It's so important, that you mentioned that there's some professors that don't have the platform that you have. I did a show on racism, structural racism as it relates to colleges and universities, and talked to some of those younger Black professors who are beautiful. You know, to get to the position that you are, and they highlighted just what you said. When you have a body of work like yours, when you have a platform like yours, you know, you're in a different category, but even that category doesn't shield you from the racist policies policies at these institutions. Your resignation letter, brilliantly written, you tweeted it out to your over 1 million Twitter followers. It went viral. And after an outcry, Harvard did offer you a 5-year contract with consideration for future tenure. They offered you more money. They offered you a chair, but you said no. You said no to all of those additional offers. Why did you turn down, the additional things that were offered after, the big outcry?
I mean, one is that I told Harvard they don't know who Irene and Clifton West is in terms of mom and dad. You know what I mean? They don't know the best of Glen Elder, which is the black community I come from, Shiloh Baptist Church. You can't negotiate respect. How in the world are you going to throw big money, throw big title, but still say no tenure? No other professor has that. They themselves are tenured. They wouldn't have that. So they think that I'm so spiritually impoverished that they could just throw money at me and I take it. No, I honor my mother and my father. That's the 5th commandment. And they taught me integrity. They taught me dignity. And there's no way that I'm going to undercut my own dignity by just taking their money. What does it profit a man or woman to gain the whole world and lose your soul, your integrity, your dignity, your sense of being a human being beyond money, beyond buying and selling, I'm
glad you quoted that scripture, Dr. West, because you accused Harvard in the resignation letter of spiritual rot. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by spiritual rot?
You remember in Hamlet what Shakespeare writes, something is rotten in Denmark. He said, the hounds of hell have been unleashed. What are the hounds of hell? Greed, hatred, hypocrisy. We can go on and on. Well, that rot has set in at Harvard, and Harvard is much more concerned about its brand and its reputation than it is its educational cause and focusing on young folk. I've noted in the letter, for example, I taught 5 courses. Most of your big money professors only teach 1. But they're not in it primarily for the young people. Right. They're in it for status. They're in it for spectacle. They're in it to be a peacock. I'm not a peacock. Peacock struck because they can't fly. No. I don't come from a peacock people. I come from fruit, foliage. By your fruit you shall know them. This is what I love about Brother Mark Riley Thomas. He understands. It's by fruit. It's the hospitals he's built. It's the impact of the lives that he's been able to have. That's the measure. And so all the money in the world, all the status in the world, big chair, they offered me 2 big chairs in 2 weeks. I said, do you know who you're dealing with? I'm a cracked vessel. I'm just trying to love my crooked neighbor with my crooked heart. But I can't be bought. Right. That's the lowest kind of response you can have to what I'm talking about. You can buy some of these other Negroes if you want, but you can't buy me. No. No way.
Professor West, you're no stranger to these Ivy League institutions. You've been at Yale, you've been at Princeton. This is your second go round at Harvard. Help us understand how in 2021 what you're describing at Harvard sounds worse than when your first go round at Harvard. So rather than making progress in terms of race and the approach to racism and inclusivity, diversity, equity, seems like Harvard has gone backwards.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know you represent the best of the legacy of Harvard Law. Harvard Law got some wonderful people. Derek Bell was my brother.
Yeah, I love Derek.
Charles Ogletree was my brother.
Yeah.
Lonnie Guarnier was my dear sister. So the people need to know that when I talk about the spiritual rot at Harvard, that doesn't mean everybody at Harvard. Harvard's got the best and the worst, but it's the dominant tendencies of an institution. And I think there's a sense in which Harvard has gone back. There's a sense in which the shadow of Jim Crow, under the superficial language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, has put out certain black faces that are highly visible. But when you actually look at how black people are treated, when you actually look at the percentage of black faculty, even with black folk in high administrative positions, if you actually look at the percentage of black faculty, it's very, very, very small. Yeah. So that's not progress. That's not moving forward, but it is moving forward in terms of your PR activity. in terms of your projection of your image and your reputation, it looks like you're doing so much. So that that's what I think, Sister Nicole, thank God for her. She was courageous in terms of turning down her alma mater. And, she got a right to love her alma mater. It shaped her. But at the same time, she got her dignity. I applaud what she's doing on the way to Howard University. Howard's a great place. Howard has its own challenges in terms of making sure it treats its faculty, especially adjunct professors, right, as they try to unionize. But all of these institutions are influenced by the dominant forces in our society, which are big money. Big money talks. Big money checks.
The numbers, because the numbers are really appalling when you look at the number of faculty. Only 10% of university faculty that have tenure are people of color, and of that 10%, I read a number that said only 3% are African American. And this is 2021. This isn't a 1965.
That's right.
21. That brings me to a conversation beyond what's happening at the academic level, Professor West. This nation, since the murder of George Floyd, May of 2020, we've been in this moment where we're having this national reckoning, this conversation around systemic racism, structural racism, and you've been at this for a long time. So I'm always intrigued to talk to people like you, because you know what this conversation looks like today, but you also know what this conversation looked like in the 50s and the 60s. Help us understand and put into context, is the conversation today substantially different than the one that was happening with Dr. Martin Luther King, with Malcolm X, in the early 60s?
Yeah, I think the big difference is this. In the 1960s, we broke the back of a barbaric apartheid system of Jim Crow. And there were two results from breaking the back. That was the black freedom struggle in the 60s. That's Fannie Lou Hamer. That's Ella Baker. That's Bob Moses. We just lost him. That's Martin King and others. Stokely Carmichael. And you had two results. For the black poor and working people, you got mass incarceration. New Jim Crow came out of the old Jim Crow. It was legal now to incarcerate. 3 strikes you out. Both parties participated. And that was tied to poverty. That was tied to decrepit schools and inadequate housing and unavailable health care and not enough jobs with a living wage. But on the other side, you got unprecedented opportunities for black middle class persons, black upper class, and we even got a few black top dogs in the industry and as well as in politics. And that's beautiful. But you end up with both realities, new Jim Crow for black poor and working class, and the shadow of Jim Crow in the form of diversity, inclusion, equity for the black middle classes. That's very different than the 1960s. But the question became, this is why Martin Luther King Jr. remains the most important figure in so many ways, because he was a middle-class brother that said what? Poverty is a crucial issue. White supremacy is a crucial issue. Militarism abroad. The 53 cents for every dollar that goes to the military that we don't have for education and healthcare. And materialism. He knew that there was a spiritual rot, a spiritual decay in our society, including the black community. See, because in the black community, if you end up with black middle class folk who are obsessed with their brand and can't wait to talk about their status and being spectacles of success and lose sight of spiritual greatness, and spiritual greatness is always service to the least of these.
Right.
That's 25th chapter, Matthew. He or she was great among you will be serving the poor, serving the working class, the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless. So black people, we have lost our spiritual richness in the face of the markets. You remember that moment in Raising in the Sun when Mama comes home and tells Walter, we used to talk about freedom, freedom, freedom. Now all we talk about is money, money, money. Used to be let freedom ring. Now it's bling, 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 bling. That's affected our black middle class. And so you end up with a black bourgeoisie who too often has neglected and even betrayed the black poor, even as it's trying to deal with the white supremacy from above. What I love about Mark Ridley Thomas, he's just like Martin Luther King Jr. He said, I will never, ever forget the black everyday people, the black poor and working people, no matter how high I ascend. Well, see, that's a spiritual achievement, my dear sister. Same is true with you. He's told me about your service, and Sister Ava, same way, brilliant as she can be, always connected to a spiritual and moral witness. We don't have enough of those. And so it's no accident. Just like recently with Nina Turner. I just got back with Nina Turner, right, in Cleveland. So you got Sister Brown beats Nina Turner. Nina Turner's talking about poverty. She's talking about health care right across the board. And Sister Brown gets big money. $3 million in the last few weeks from outside sources, big corporations, oil, gas, fossil fuel, and so forth. You say, wait a minute. I thought that the black freedom struggle was about the least of these. It's not just about the black bourgeoisie and the black upper middle class doing well. We are not the measure of the black freedom struggle's progress. The measure is the brother and sister on the block. Do they have access? Are they being respected? Can they live lives of decency and dignity, you see? And so spiritually, we find ourselves in a crisis. And that's what Martin understood. Spiritual, economic, political, and social.
Well, you mentioned that race, obviously, and some are framing it as a inner fight in the Democratic Party between the progressives and the centrists and moderate Democrats, and we'll see how that plays out. I hope that the Democrats can stay focused on the real enemy, and that's Trump and Republicans, in the upcoming midterm elections. But I do want to ask you about this historic increase in support for Black Lives Matter and interest in this whole conversation about systemic racism that we saw immediately following the murder of George Floyd and the protests. We saw Confederate statues that came down. We saw bands and singing groups changing their names. We saw products from Uncle Ben to Aunt Jemima, changing their names. But now we're in this predictable backlash, restrictive voting rights legislation happening across the country, attacks on critical race theory. Were these expected? Did you expect to see the backlash that we're seeing, following this moment where we were all focused on how do we dismantle structural racism?
No, I wasn't surprised, my dear sister. You remember that classic song written by the genius Nina Simone called Backlash Blues?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, I want all of your listeners to go home and listen to that tonight. Because she saw it clearly. Anytime there's been a major public manifestation of Black people and other people in solidarity with our struggle, making progress, you get a backlash. There's no doubt about it. Reconstruction, 1960s, Reagan and Nixon and Reagan, and with Trump and company. And so we shouldn't be surprised. But the problem is that, as you say, we got to keep our focus on the suffering and the social misery of poor and working people. But we also have to keep people accountable who do go in high places and too often become indifferent to that suffering.
Do you think, Dr. West, a lot of what we saw was performative? The big companies were doing big press releases. There were social media campaigns, blackout on Instagram, and we saw a lot of companies. You saw the NFL that had been so hostile to the players taking a knee when Colin Kaepernick, had the audacity in their minds to honor, victims of police violence. Do you think a lot of that was performative, or do you really think we're at a point where white people in particular are really, ready and willing to wrestle with, the history of racism in this country?
Well, it's a wonderful question because, again, we should never look at our white brothers and sisters like a monolithic block. So you got a lot of young white brothers and sisters on fire for fighting against murdering of Black people, police brutality, on fire for Black freedom. So that there is a difference, generationally speaking, regionally speaking. Certain regions are much more reactionary than other regions. But generally, in terms of the response and the status quo, you were right. I would say it's symbolic and performative. It's not substantive and transformational. And you only talk about substance and transformation when you're talking about making resources available. You see,
You talk a lot about, resources, you bring that up. So do you think this conversation that we're having around structural racism is too narrow? Do you think we need to be talking about, I know you have, spent a lot of time talking about poverty. You talk about lifting people up out of poverty. This conversation around structural racism, although, included in it is addressing marginalized populations and people who are, in the poorest communities in our country, but there doesn't seem to be a huge focus in these conversations around poverty. And I'll ask you this because I'll tell you this. I had an interview with Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, Nice Racism, and she makes a distinction between racism and classism, and she says we should not conflate the two. Do you think, Dr. DiAngelo is right in that assessment?
I thought you were talking about Robin D.J. Kelly. Now, see, that brother, towering intellectual he knows that class and race are always intertwined. And so the other Robin, talking about white fragility, concerned about white fears, insecurities, and anxieties, well, that's not the place to start a discourse about white supremacy. White supremacy, any discussion of white supremacy ought to begin with indigenous people suffering, black people suffering, brown people suffering, and how do you alleviate it? You don't start with white folk fears and see how that's going to work. Because what happens is you're not going to get fundamental transformation by talking about white people's fears. You're going to get some psychic shifts in their minds, but you're not going to get fundamental transformation. Fundamental transformation will come not when you got black faces in high places to make white folk feel less anxious, but when the structures themselves share power, share resources. When you talk about poverty, what you're really talking about is the sharing of power and resources, because poor people don't choose to be poor. They don't have access to resources. They don't have access to power. And the sharing of power is a very different thing than a corporation saying, oh, we're going to give this particular money for our diversity to make us look good on the next commercial and bring in some black faces here and there and appoint them as head of the diversity committee. And yet the power structure is still the same. So you end up with things a little more colorful at the top, but the structure is still the same. See, that's what needs to be called into question.
And under that, going with that concept, what does that look like? What is changing the structure? Because you said obviously putting a couple of black people in positions of power, that ain't changing nothing. We've been there. We did that, affirmative action in the 60s and 70s, and then we cited those numbers about the, black tenured professors. So we know that didn't work.
That's right.
What does transformation look like?
I'll give you a good example. One of the greatest prophets of our day is Marian Wright Edelman. She's been at it for 60 years, Children Defense Fund, right? Calling for what? Abolishing child poverty, not alleviate, abolishing child poverty. Now, we know in the last few months, child poverty has been reduced 60%. 60% with just 3 programs.
Yeah.
Instead of the trillions of dollars going to Wall Street to bail them out, instead of the trillions of dollars to subsidize various businesses, some of that money went directly to poor people, especially for our precious children, no matter what color the child. Right. 60% reduction in child poverty, the very thing that Martin was calling for, the very thing Marian Wright Edelman called for 60 years in 6 months. Why? Because people need resources. And the government decided, under the pandemic and so forth, they were going to do it. Now, the question is, will they sustain it? It's only temporary. Mm-hmm. They pull that money back, the children fall right back into poverty. That's making resources available. And the government makes resources available for corporate elites, with Wall Street gangsters involved in insider trading and market manipulation and fraudulent activity and predatory lending. None of them went to jail and they still got trillions of dollars. That's resources. How come poor people can't get that? How come working people can't get that? Our priorities are warped. Mm-hmm. That's a moral and a spiritual question, you see. So that in that regard, that's what some access to resources looks like. In this case, child poverty. Now, you still got significant numbers of people who are poor who are not children.
So a significant part of that reduction in child poverty was a result of the tax credit, the child tax credit, which is allowing up to $300 per child.
Per child, that's right.
Per child per month to families who are earning under, I think it's $150,000, but families who obviously need the money. That was because Biden and his administration. So are you at all encouraged by the fact that Trump lost in 2020 and that the Biden-Harris administration has made the reduction of childhood poverty one of their priorities? Are you encouraged by this administration that we get to some of that transformative change that you say is necessary?
Well, see, that's part of the pressure that we've been putting on the Biden administration. I supported Biden in a critical way because I'm against the neo-fascist gangster named Trump. So I had to hold my breath and vote for Biden. I had to hold my breath because Biden was the architect of mass incarceration. See, that for me is a crime against humanity. He was the architect for the invasion of occupation of Iraq. That's a million Iraqis dead. That's a crime against humanity and so forth. So that in that sense, I had to hold my breath, vote for Biden, and put pressure on him to push through these bills. He has responded. I applaud that. But he's the same brother running around telling everybody America's not a racist nation. Even Sister Harrison, we're not a racist nation. Clyburn, we're not a racist nation. I say, get off the crack fighting. What are you talking about? Y'all can't even tell the truth of a nation being racist. We made progress. We're less racist than we used to be. But you can't even tell the truth of being a racist nation. You got to be PR about that just because Kim Scott said it. Where's the truth telling? Where's the integrity in what you say, you see? So that I agree with Biden when he pushes through on something like that. Just like I agree with Brother Obama. Healthcare, beautiful. Should have gone further. Still had 20 million who didn't get it. The ones who did get it, got it. That's a beautiful thing. I support that. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to point out the relationship between big pharmaceutical companies and politicians, or big private insurance companies and politicians preventing single-payer health care,
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Those of us that want to see transformative change have to keep the pressure on those.
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
The state houses across this country. We see Cori Bush. She's from my hometown, St. Louis. Junior woman sleeping on the steps of the Capitol to put pressure on the Biden administration to extend those eviction moratoriums. And it was, Schumer said, single-handedly, one woman changed the whole nature of that conversation. So having activists like Cori Bush who become legislators, we see makes a big difference in the way that the Biden administration or any administration responds to the needs of everyday people. So,
and we keep in mind, Sister Cori was there, because she had planned to be with us. We were going to be together with Nina, but she did the right thing in staying there. But she was there because she has a deep care and concern for 11 million fellow human beings who are going to be evicted. She had a spiritual and a moral force behind her that had her sleeping outside. The same Biden administration saying no circumstances under which we can extend it. Now they changed their mind. That kind of pressure makes a difference. I applaud her in a serious way, but I also applaud the spiritual and moral forces behind her. She's there because the people are suffering. And that's got to be our starting point.
Yeah, right after Cori got national attention for obviously having the courage and the will and the determination to do something on the eviction moratorium, she made a statement about her private security. And it came out that she has spent $70,000 or so on private security. And she got asked a question about defunding the police, which, was a hot button issue in 2020. And she's catching some flack right now because they say, look, you just gave the GOP a talking point as you talk about defunding the police while you're admittedly paying for private security, paying thousands of dollars for private security. Where do you think this nation needs to be on the issue of reimagining public safety? And I've had an opportunity to talk with a lot of folks, including Cori Bush, about this comment. But when I talk to everyday Black people, when I have everyday Black people on the special report, they tell me they want more police, not less police in their neighborhoods. Where do you think what should be the approach of this administration on this whole issue of how do we make neighborhoods safe and end the kind of brutality against Black people that we've seen over the last, several decades in this country?
Well, one is, I think, my dear sister, we've got to focus on everyday people. They must have security. They also must have their dignity protected as they are being secured, so that they don't want rights violated. They don't want their humanity called into question, but they do want protection. That's true for any human being. Now, so that when we talk about defunding the police, I think what we really mean is we want a public safety system in which Black people are protected, just like anybody else, just like Beverly Hills, just like wherever else one is. We want protection. We also want service. We don't want our rights violated. We don't want our humanity called into question. And we also want other resources and services given our impoverished situation in the hood. And that's jobs, that's healthcare, that's housing, that's education. And so much of the money for the more punitive activities could go to some of those more social-oriented ones. So that in a way, you can imagine, the slogan itself can be used and weaponized in a number of different ways. But the crucial thing is always get beneath the language to the lived experience of the precious human beings we're talking about. So if you go up to a brother on the corner and say, it's very dangerous here. We need to have more police. We understand what you're saying, brother. You want more security. Do you want more police slapping you upside the head and doing in your friends? No, I don't. I want accountability of the police. I want accountability of the police. Do you want social services? Do you want grocery stores that have healthy foods in the community? Do you want jobs with a living wage? Yes, I do, my brother. So that once you see what they are really talking about, the question becomes for politicians and leaders, kind of thing Brother Mark Willie Thomas has been doing all his life. Say, look, we're going to use a language that stays in contact with the suffering of the people. Because the people are thinking critically. They have their own language, right? But it's a lot of times it's not filtered into the slogans used by those that on television.
Yeah, it's nuanced, and I think you put it right.
Exactly.
People live in impoverished communities. They want to be safe. Everybody wants to be safe.
Everybody wants security and safety. Absolutely.
But definitely, Black folks are unanimous in their calls for a police department or policing that respects their dignity and their humanity.
Absolutely. And they want safety vis-a-vis each other. Because poor folk all concentrated in one place. Most of the crimes, 92% of the crimes in America take place within close proximity of space. Yeah. And so you got danger from each other and the police at the same time. Black folk deserve safety and security like anybody else.
Yeah, and just last topic I want to ask you about, Dr. West, is this whole debate that's happening around critical race theory. And you mentioned Nicole Hannah Brown. Obviously she wrote that brilliant piece, the 1619 Project, and has sparked this debate about how we teach, history in this country, and what are we teaching, whether it's in the K through 12 education system or college and university. And we saw again after George Floyd this flurry of activity around reading lists. Everybody had their reading list, books you can read to become more astute about Black history and what it means to be woke and what it means to be an ally. You have been in institutions like Harvard, where Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and the folks who are the originators of this whole critical theory concept. Help us understand where we should be and how we should be talking about race, slavery, and teaching the history of this country to not just Black folks, but to white folks and to every American.
Absolutely. I mean, if one were to actually go back to our dear sister Kimberly Crenshaw's essay that she wrote, which is really the spark in 1988, Mapping the Margins, and it had to do with identity politics and violence against Black women. And she talked about its relation to class, gender, age, intersectionality. How do we have solidarity with different people struggling against various kinds of suffering and social misery? You notice the suffering of Black people, the social misery of Black people hardly even surfaces in this. It's just they want to police certain individuals because critical race theory has been weaponized by Fox News, right wing, whatever it is. Do you have a concern with the suffering? If you don't have a concern with the suffering, we can't have a serious conversation.
Yeah.
Kimberly Crenshaw from the very beginning was concerned about this suffering, especially this violence coming at Black women. So that gender became not just an abstract category, it became the experience of precious Black sisters who've been wrestling with all of these various forms of psychic and physical and social violence. So that now I was blessed, as you know, to write the foreword. When they asked me to do it in 1995, I said, yes, indeed, because this is the lifting of all the voices. We talk about Negro National Anthem. We need the voices of those who are suffering to be able to make sense out of how we overcome this suffering. So critical race theory is simply what? A moment in the history of the Black freedom movement when new voices come forward, especially Black women voices, Black queer voices, and others, but it's connected to the suffering of others across the board. And if no one has any interest in the suffering, then just be honest about it. Be candid and get out of my way, because I'm concerned about the suffering. You know what I mean? And whatever theory you want to call it, it's a lens through which you view the world. Sister Kimberly says it so brilliantly. She said, critical race theory is not a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's new lens to see. Do you see the suffering and ways in which people are resisting? Do you see what is standing in the way of people living lives of dignity? And if you're uninterested in seeing it, then it's a Keith Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. Something just ain't right. If you don't want to see the suffering, then be candid about it and say, no, you just don't give a dang about these people suffering. And once you say that, it's hard to have any serious conversation because it's clear they're just rationalizing their own indifference toward the suffering.
Yeah, just finally, I want to ask you, Dr. West, you did mention that you were somewhat encouraged by what you've seen from the Biden administration, particularly around this reduction in child poverty. If you were, if you were in charge of everything, the government and, the policymakers, and you had an unlimited budget, what are 3 of the changes you think could be made that would start to have this transformative impact that you talk so much about? Like, what are 3 specific things that you think we need to be doing in this country to address, these issues of poverty and structural racism, structural sexism that we see, that, things that we could do immediately if you were in charge? What would those 3 things be?
Well, again, I'm following Brother Martin King. Abolition is about poverty. How do you abolish poverty? Make resources available in terms in the private sector, jobs with a living wage. You got to have strong trade unions. You have to have strong mechanisms by which people who work actually get paid decent, serious, substantive wages. And then the government has to be able to come in to make sure that the weak and the others, the homeless, have places to go and so forth. That's one. The attenuation of militarism. Our foreign policy needs to be radically called into question. So much money going out AFRICOM in Africa. We just had, $3.8 million to our Jewish brothers and sisters in the state of Israel. $3.8 billion. Now, what kind of accountability vis-a-vis Palestinians? You're treating them less like they're less than human. We have to have some accountability of that. I would say the same thing for Muslims in China. If we were giving China, I would say the same thing for Jews in Russia. If we were giving Russia, any group that's being mistreated, when we give money, we ought to have some accountability to ensure that we're not reinforcing vicious occupations and dominations and so forth. Same would be true in Egypt where we give money. I say exactly the same thing about Egypt. That's Martin Luther King. Attenuating militarism, that means we better cut back some of that money for militarism to rechannel it into social issues. That's the second thing. But the third thing, my dear sisters, is much more elusive. And that's the spiritual moral question. You see, you got to have examples of people in public life, like Brother Mark Ridley Thomas and others. We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about integrity, consistency. When people see them, it's almost like seeing Luther Vandross or Aretha. There goes somebody who empowers me. There goes somebody concerned about me. There goes somebody who...
You think we don't have enough examples of that?
Not at all. It's hard to even think of major politicians, major entertainers, major celebrities, when folks see them, they should see their spiritual greatness and their courage to fight against injustice rather than their money, their blitz, their glitz, their status. That's a different thing. When people saw Curtis Mayfield, they didn't say, oh, he got all those Grammys. He didn't win a Grammy. We didn't give a goddamn. He gave his heart. He gave his soul, because his music was for us. It empowered us.
Right.
See what I mean? That's the crucial thing. We used to have preachers and choirs like that. Now with all these prayer teams and these word
That's
preachers,
a whole nother show talking about
you ain't lying. You ain't lying. Hey, what happened to our great tradition? We are great people. Let's manifest our greatness in our service to the least of these.
Yeah, excellent three things. Just anyone that, and I don't know who that someone is, but there might be someone out there that is not as familiar with your work. You've written so many incredible books, Race Matters, Democracy Matters. Which of those, many best-selling books would you recommend that someone pick up if they want to really understand this transformative, democracy that you talk about, this way that we transform our democracy and include everyone? How do we get to this place that you just talked about? Which of your books do you recommend?
Well, I tell you, before I read the books, they ought to go hear James Lawson give the eulogy for John Lewis on C-SPAN. He over 90, still strong as ever. They ought to listen to Curtis Mayfield's New World Order before they get to my book. And if you have time, then I would read Race Matters. I would read Race Matters, absolutely.
I love that. I had an opportunity to watch that eulogy, and I live in Los Angeles, so I've had an opportunity to hear Lawson, Dr. Lawson, Professor Lawson, Pastor Lawson preach in person, and there's nothing more inspiring than listening to him. And I also had an opportunity to meet the great John Lewis. Professor West, you are such a pleasure. It's been such an honor for me to sit down with you, pick your brain. You got so much more in there. I could spend hours talking with you, but thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for, you said something today that just resonated with me. I'd read it before, but hearing you say it really just had so much power when you said you can't negotiate respect. I don't think there's anything more powerful than that. And if there's anything anyone's going to take away from this interview, I think that's the most important thing that you've said, you've done, and you live that. I want to have you back before the midterm elections, talk about what's coming up.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Continue to build on this progress that we're making. But again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your work and your service. I
salute you. I salute you.
Thank you. Wow, what an inspiring and empowering interview. Dr. West has been someone I've watched, I've followed. Of course, I've read his work. I've read many of his books. I've had an opportunity to actually sit on a panel with him, to hear him lecture, to hear him give the most incredible speeches. I don't even know, short of Martin Luther King, if there's another person as inspiring as an orator or as Professor West. But it was really just an honor to sit down with him. I hope you got as much out of his interview as I did. As I said to him, before I said goodbye, that phrase, you can't negotiate respect, is one that I think all of us, we can take away from this interview and use that in our day-to-day lives. We are all faced with so many encounters where people are asking us to compromise our morals, to compromise our principles. And he said that no matter how much money Harvard threw at him, it wasn't worth him compromising his principle. And I love how he talked about Harvard didn't know who he was. They didn't know what black man they were dealing with. They didn't know his history. They didn't know his mama, his daddy, his grandmama, his grandfather, and the black folks whose shoulders he stands on. So again, bravo to Dr. West for standing up to what arguably is the most powerful institution in this nation, Harvard University. And hopefully because he stood up, someone else won't have to go through what he went through. Some young professor that's up for tenure, Harvard will think twice about treating that professor in the way that they treated Dr. West. Some words to live by before I get out. as much as things change, as you've heard from Dr. West, they really remain the same. A few statues of Confederate heroes have been taken down, and former officer Derek Chauvin has been convicted of 3 counts of murder for the death of George Floyd. But when it comes to sustained and concerted efforts to end police brutality and to close the racial wealth gap, to bring people out of poverty, life has changed very little. Well, as Dr. West said, this is America. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget we're all in this together.